from the other class, the one that combined in here. And between that and then crew class on Sunday mornings, we never started on time at all. I mean, we're 5 or 10 minutes late is not late at all. That's early. So which makes these Wednesday nights very long. But we'll try to at least stay a little bit on track. For those of you who I may not have met or don't know me, my name is Zach Starnes. Again, I was teaching in the other class with Wayne and Toby, and we got called over here, which we were very excited to come over here because we had a great class, a great discussion, but I think we can have more discussion in here, and obviously a larger class helps. But this is my first opportunity to teach in here, so I am certainly not a preacher of any sort. So, I am not great at just sitting up here and talking the whole time. So I need discussion. I need some feedback. So I do ask a lot of questions, and so hopefully we'll get a little bit of that tonight. That's what I rely on a little bit. Hopefully you guys will help me out there just a little bit. One of the things that we talked about in last quarter extensively was these themes that you could see throughout the first section of the book that we were working through. These things that just kept coming up over and over again, and you would see something in Genesis, and then it popped back up in Exodus, and a little bit later on as well. And one of the themes that we've seen then that I think we're going to see much more of now moving forward is the sovereignty of God. And what does that mean? The sovereignty of God it's a big term, it's a confusing term. What does it mean in simple ideas? Or what does it mean that God is sovereign? He answers to no one. Absolutely. He's in charge. He's in control. Everything is working according to his plan. This was, I think, from one of my study Bibles. I had this definition. The doctrine of the sovereignty of God teaches that everything that occurs in heaven or on earth, from the greatest to the least, unfolds according to the purpose and plan of God. There are simply no surprises for him because he established the plan from all eternity. Again, this is a difficult concept for me to come to grips with at times because it's hard to reconcile something that is going on that clearly displeases God. We know God's not happy about this. This is not what he wants. This is not what he desires, but it's happening. It's hard to reconcile that with the fact that this is his plan. He doesn't want that to happen. He wishes it didn't happen. He's going to encourage his followers not to let that happen, but it's still his plan, and if that's what needs to happen for his plan to go through, he's going to do that. He's going to work with that. He is still in control. His plan is still in place. Some of the stories that we'll read, that we'll go over, I think, over the next several weeks, including what we're going to cover tonight, give some additional reassurance that no matter what the circumstances are, no matter how dire it seems or how just terrible it may seem, God's plan will be accomplished in whatever manner he deems necessary. And we're certainly going to see that tonight. So we're going to looking tonight at the first 9 chapters of 1 Samuel. And a little helpful to have a little bit shorter area. I know Trey a couple weeks ago had like the entire book of Judges, and I know in past classes we've had like a book and a half to cover. So just to have 9 chapters is a little bit of breath of fresh air. And so we'll do a little bit of reading tonight too, which will help on some of the points. But remember how we got here. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they got out of Egypt and going through the wilderness and get to Mount Sinai where they make a covenant with God. Eventually, they come into the Promised Land, into Canaan. Israel was supposed to be faithful to God, his commands, but as Trey talked about a few weeks ago, the book of Judges tells us just how horribly they were failing at this. The leaders of Israel, who were the judges, they got progressively worse over time, and it became clearly apparent that Israel had a need for wise and faithful leaders, which is another one of the themes that we're going to talk about, this need for wise and faithful leaders and kind of an ongoing search to find those and to avoid the ones who aren't fitting that role. So, starting with 1 Samuel 1, we're introduced to an Israelite woman named Hannah. Hannah is married to Elkanah, but she is unable to have children. He has children with one of his other wives, but not with her. As you can imagine, this grieves her terribly. Each year, she and her family travel to Shiloh to worship and make sacrifices at the temple there. One year in particular, she is at Shiloh, and apparently there's some other person there who's her rival, is what she's referred to, but she is continually provoking and just kind of prodding her, irritating her with the fact that you can't have children, which is just a terrible thing, but she's doing that, and of course that upsets and grieves Hannah greatly, on top of the fact that she wants to have children. Now you got someone who's prodding at her. So as they're finishing eating, Hannah prays to the Lord and makes a vow in verse 11 of chapter 1. which says, "And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." Now, does that sound familiar, the no razor touching his head? What is that? Have we seen that somewhere else at some point? Do what? Samson, yeah. It's the Nazarite vow. So it's exactly the vow that Samson's mother made back in Judges for him. Hannah here is so deeply in prayer to the Lord that Eli, who's the priest, believes that she's drunk. She's sitting there. She has her eyes closed and her mouth is moving, and he thinks that she's drunk, which is a problem, especially because she's in that condition in the sanctuary. So he gets on to her, and what are you doing? And she says, "No, I'm not drunk." He realizes she's not drunk. She is, the words they use is pouring out her soul before the Lord. And when he sees her and he sees how deeply in prayer, how just strong her conviction is, he blesses her. He gives her a blessing. He wants the Lord to give her what she desires. And wouldn't you know it, after Hannah and Elkanah return to their home, they are together. And then in verse 19, we're told that the Lord remembered her, and she conceived and bore a son. Hannah names his son Samuel, the name of the book, which means name of God or heard by God or maybe even offspring of God. Whatever it happens to mean, the point is that Hannah acknowledged in naming Samuel that God had given her a son. She had asked for it, and God had given it to her. That was the purpose of his name. She was acknowledging that. And more than that, she keeps her vow. She vowed, "God, give me a son, and I'll give him back to you." It's exactly what she does. Once Samuel is weaned, she takes him back to Shiloh. She presents him to Eli and says, "Hey, remember me? I was the girl you thought was drunk, and I was really just praying to God for a son. And I said, if he would give me a son, I'll give him back. Here's the son, and I'm giving him back. I'm giving this to the Lord there, which is an uncommon thing. It's, again, a little bit of a breath of fresh air to see that. And then in chapter 2, we have Hannah. Starts out with Hannah's prayer. And it's somewhat familiar. It looks a lot like Mary's prayer. It looks a lot like the Magnificat. There's a lot of the same verbiage that's used in there. My heart exalts in the Lord. Remember we sing that on Sundays. But it begins with this poem. In the poem, Hannah talks about how God opposes the proud, how he exalts the humble, which he does, and how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. That's sovereignty. Despite whatever is going on, his plan, his purposes are going to be worked out, and they're being worked out. That's what her prayer is. That's what her poem is. At the very end, she also makes a statement about how God one day raise up an anointed king for his people. In verse 10, the adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. And then she says, the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. I've got to think that Hannah's poem was set out specifically here to let us know, hey, this is coming. This is going to be a theme we're going to talk about through 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel is really just one book. It was split apart because of the length, but it's really just, it's Samuel. But it's split apart 1st and 2nd Samuel. For both of those books, the kingship, the kingdom of Israel, and a king being put over Israel is a huge thing. And we're talking about it right here. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Again, we'll see some of these themes come over and over again into next week as well. Now, as complex as Scripture can be sometimes it's hard. Sometimes you read stuff 5 times and I can't tell you exactly what it's telling you, and scholars can't really tell you exactly what it says. It can be complex, but there's sometimes when it is refreshingly blunt. And verse 12 is one of those times. Verse 12 reads, now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. That is about as clear as it can be. And can you imagine you're a son of Eli, and for the rest of eternity you're known as a worthless man who didn't know the Lord. But don't worry, it was certainly earned by each of them. We're given an example of their worthlessness, and it relates to the share that they were taking as priests of the sacrifices that were being offered. And this is one of those things, like, you have these stories that maybe when you were growing up, you heard sometimes, yeah, that sounds familiar, but I don't remember exactly. This is one where the assistant took a fork and stuck it into the pot when they were cooking, and then pulled it out. And whenever he pulled out, that was what the priest got for their portion, which has nothing to do with what it was supposed to happen. The priests were given specific portions of animals, period. There was nothing about sticking a fork in anything. That's just what they chose to do, mainly because when they would stick the fork in it, they would get the good parts. They would get the extra special parts that they wanted. Again, Deuteronomy and Leviticus we went over those for a couple of weeks. You know all the rules and regulations about everything from what the priests could wear to what the temple would look like to everything, to what sacrifices looked like and what part these priests got. There were detailed, specific instruction and rules to be followed. And what Eli's sons were doing here had very, very, very little in common with these regulations. To make it even worse, not only are they not following the directions they've been given, they are, when ordinary worshipers are pointing out, hey, that's wrong. You're doing something wrong. The priest, or the priest assistant, threaten them. They say, you're going to give me what I told you, or we're going to forcibly take it from you. Now, trying to think of an example now, we can't think, this is what I thought of. So you walk into the sanctuary on Sunday morning, and I'll pick on Wayne because he's right here. And Wayne is standing there by the bucket of Lord's Supper. And you pick a Lord's Supper, he says, all right, what I need you to do is go ahead and open that up. I need you to split that tiny little cracker in half, and you put half of it here on my plate. And you open up your cup and pour about half of it out into my big cup here. And then you can go. And if you say, Wayne, what are you talking about? That has nothing to do with Lord's Supper. We don't talk about that anywhere. And he said, if you don't do it, or maybe Tim Thomas, or maybe Mr. Harris or something, I am going to forcibly take it from you and make you do that for me. Now, obviously, that's ridiculous. Like, you can't even comprehend something like that. That wouldn't make sense for us at all. But that's what was happening here. They were saying, the words is, no, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force. That's in verse 16. So the point is, Eli's sons were acting horribly, acting in ways that they knew was wrong, that ordinary worshipers knew was wrong, ways that were evil. And we're now given a little bit of a parallel between these evil sons of Eli and Samuel, who was growing up. Samuel's been placed there by his mom, and he is ministering before the Lord. We're told in verse 21 in chapter 2, verse 21, we're told that he, quote, grew in the presence of the Lord. And then later on in verse 26, it says, now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. So we've got a clear distinction here between the sons of Eli and what they were doing wrong, and Samuel, who was being raised up. Again, we're talking about looking for that wise and faithful leader. The sons of Eli aren't it. It's pretty clear. So we've got Samuel, who was being raised as one of those possible wise and faithful leaders. At the very end of chapter 2, we're told about a man of God, a prophet, who comes to see Eli. And he has certain things to say to Eli, and he has certain questions. And one of the questions he asks Eli, why is Eli scorning the Lord? Now, what does Eli have to do with this? His sons were acting horribly, but there's no evidence that Eli was doing these kind of things. So why is it a problem for Eli? Why is Eli on the hook here? Eli's the father, yeah. Eli's the father. He's the one in charge. He's allowing it to happen. For whatever reason, he's allowing it to happen. He is, the way that the prophet of the Lord here, the man of God, says, is he's honoring his sons by allowing them to continue with their evil actions. As a result of him honoring his sons, the prophet tells Eli about a curse that's going to be not only against his sons, but him, Eli, and his entire family. And that's going to result in all of his descendants dying at a fairly young age, rather than living to an old age, which is, obviously in those times it was a very horrible thing. It's horrible now, but it's even worse then. I'm not old enough. I may be one of the younger ones in this room. I'm not old enough yet to have children that are old enough that I can't threaten pretty severely and get them to follow and do what I tell them to do. I've got four kids. The girls, I can kind of look at the wrong way and they'll just crumble. Except Adeline, she's a different story, but we'll just leave her out there. The boys, if I threaten to take away their dessert or like their second portion, they're done. They'll do whatever I tell them to do. So I'm not there yet. I understand at some point I will be. At some point they will be old enough to make decisions on their own and not be that scared about the consequences that I say. No, they're going to take it from me. They're going to take it from me. And there's a day when they can make decisions, and I pray, and it's what we all do. We all spend this time right now trying to instill in them the values that are important so that they know inside what the right decision is to make, so that when you're not there to make it for them, they do it. But we also know that doesn't always happen. It just doesn't work that way. I hope, I hope that I'm never faced with that kind of decision. I hope none of you are either. I also understand, and I think this story is here for a reason, to show us that if that situation comes, whether it's a son or a spouse or a very good friend or a parent or another family member, whatever it is, if there's a decision to be made between honoring, allowing something to continue to occur that is not right, and showing all of your, putting your faith and putting your trust and putting everything you've got in the Lord and following His regulations, His rules, His commands that He's given us, we've got to select the Lord over anybody else. I am not there yet. If I had to do something, if I had to push away one of my sons or one of my daughters, I could not. I'm not there. Maybe I'll never be there. So I'm not trying to say this. Oh, it's easy, guys. Just pick the Lord. Don't pick your kids. No, that's silly. I'm not saying that. But I think it's in there for a reason, because we know that's going to happen sometimes. It does happen when you have to make very difficult decisions. And I think you can see the consequences, and Eli certainly suffered the consequences of not making that decision, not making it correctly, of allowing this evil to continue to occur, despite the fact that he knew that it wasn't right. These ordinary members, it wasn't something that was just kind of wrong. It was clearly wrong, and he allowed it to occur. But on from that, as we move on, chapter 3, we get to see when the Lord first calls Samuel to be a prophet. At this point, Samuel is living with Eli, and he is spending his time ministering to the Lord. And again, we've been told that he is growing in stature and favor with God and with man, so he's doing a good job. He is being trained up correctly. And we're not told exactly how old he is when this happens, but obviously he's still growing up here. So verses 4 through 7 reads as follows: Then the Lord called Samuel. Let me start a little bit early so we can say what's happening here. At that time, Eli, starting in verse 2, at that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli. Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. And the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. Now, I don't know if any of you had kids growing up that would frequently come in your room in the middle of the night. I've got one right now. Every night she's going to be in there for something. And it's something completely ridiculous. Not like, hey, can I get a glass of water? Like, that would be normal. Hey, can you help me with this? But like, why is the sky blue? Like, it's not blue right now. It's black because it's bedtime. You need to go back to bed. Or just completely ridiculous question. What is love? Yeah, try to answer what is love at about 1 o'clock in the morning. So I got a feeling Eli here might be having a little frustration. Like the first time, you're like, oh, hey, it's okay. Well, let's get you back in bed, make sure you're good. When it happens again, you're like, okay, dude, we just had this conversation. Everything is fine. You go back to bed. But it keeps going. In verse 8, and the Lord called Samuel again the third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. And then something clicks for Eli. Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore, Eli says to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant hears. Then the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. So the Lord tells Samuel, he gives him, again, he speaks to him for the first time and tells him exactly what he's going to do. He's going to punish the house of Eli, just like the man of God said earlier, because of the wickedness of Eli's sons who were blaspheming God and because Eli failed to restrain them. Now, normally, maybe a curse or a threat such as this could possibly be atoned for by sacrifice. You know, hey, we've said we've done this bad thing. We know something bad's going to happen. Can we make a sacrifice and kind of clear it out? Make sure maybe it's not quite as bad. The Lord wants to go ahead and cut that off. So we're not doing this. The iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. He's making it clear. This is what's going to happen in the discussion. Now, of course, Samuel doesn't want to tell Eli this. This is terrible news for him. It's really bad news. But Eli makes him. He says, tell me what happened. And Samuel tells Eli, and Eli does accept the punishment somewhat humbly. In verse 18, it says, so Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. So he says, it's, know what's going to happen. And we tell, and Samuel grew, in verse 19, and the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. So, again, we're getting this picture of a wise and faithful leader being brought up. Now not only is he growing in stature around the folks that know him there at Shiloh, he's growing across the nation, across the area, knowing that he is wise, he is faithful, none of his words are falling to the ground. Again, it's just a further kind of showing of where we're headed. We're headed to a new beginning here without the judges eventually. We get a break from in chapter 4. Instead, we learn about some pretty disastrous events that happened to the Israelites. We're introduced to the Philistines and told there's a battle between them and the Israelites, which went poorly for the Israelites. They were soundly defeated to the tune of losing about 4,000 men during the battle. So the elders of Israel respond to this loss in verse 3. And when the people came to the camp after this battle had ceased, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from this power of our enemies. Cool. Quick review. What does the ark of the covenant signify? What is it? What's its purpose? What does it show at that time? The presence of God. Yeah, it shows the presence. It's the visible sign of the presence and the power of God. We know the ark had been brought into battle before as a sign that God was fighting. He was present there. He was fighting for Israel. Is there anything that just kind of comes off wrong about this statement by the elders? Let us bring the ark of the covenant here that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. Anything just kind of seem off about that statement? Absolutely, yeah. They viewed it as almost a tool, and the ark as a tool, not God as a tool. I mean, bad enough. They're treating it as a tool for battle rather than with the respect that it deserved. It was worthy of respect. It was worthy of honor, but not because it was the ark, because of what it represented. It represented the power and the presence of God. Exactly. It was. They were treating it as an idol, as this idea that he said, hey, if we can bring this ark, forget about God and whatever. If we can get this ark and we can bring it to where we're at in battle, we are assured of winning. We will win this battle as long as we have this ark, which we know is not the case. Just having the ark there doesn't bring them victory. We know, and they're going to find out here pretty soon. But what they fail to realize, the ark is not an instrument to attain victory. It's the presence of God. And this failure to recognize there's a distinction there, and it's not just, hey, let's get the ark and bring it here, turns out to be even more disastrous for the Israelites. In verses 10 and 11, so they get this, they get the ark to them, and when they get there, they're excited. There's a loud cry from their camp. They think, oh, we won now. We've got the ark here. Again, not really focusing on the fact that they've not done it the right way. We've got the ark. And the Philistines hear it, and they're scared because they've heard of the ark. They think they see the ark as more of a god or a house for a god, and so they're frightened about it. But they don't flee. They decide, hey, we got to give it everything we got. everything we got. And then verse 10, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled, every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And the ark of the God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So clearly, the ark being there did not have the intended effect. It didn't just assure them a victory. In fact, it was a worse defeat than before. They went from losing 4,000 to losing 30,000, and losing these two, great leaders. They're two important leaders for them. They weren't great, but they were important for them. And everyone is headed home. So after this battle, a messenger runs back to Shiloh, where Eli's at, to deliver the news. Now you got kind of an interesting picture here of Eli sitting by the road, waiting for news of this, watching, but he can't watch because he's going blind. He can't see very well, but he's still sitting there in his chair, waiting for it to come. And so here comes this man of Benjamin, this messenger, who runs back and delivers the bad news. And it gets kind of progressively bad for Eli as it goes on. Not only, Israel's been defeated. You think, oh, that's terrible. Oh, and by the way, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're dead. Oh, that is awful. And then he said, and the Ark of the Covenant has been stolen. It's been taken by the Philistines. Now, Eli takes the news okay until he hears about the Ark. As soon as he hears about the Ark, as soon as the words are spoken, he's sitting in his chair. He falls backwards in his chair and breaks his neck and dies, which is a horrible, horrible way to die. It says, it was kind of interesting, it says he was, his neck was broken and he died, for the man was old and heavy, so he was overweight apparently, and the weight of his body broke his neck, which is a horrible way to die, an awful thing, but it does, if you have little kids, you always want to find a scriptural reference for like things not to do, so the next time the boys are leaning back in their chair at the kitchen table, they're going to learn about Eli, who died when he broke his neck. And I bet they never do that again, at least for a while, until we have to go talk about that again. I thought that was a great option here. But a horrible, horrible way to die. Yes, I mean, that's the important part. We'll go for it. So the Philistines now, they've stolen the ark. You would imagine that the Philistines are feeling pretty happy with themselves right now. They have soundly defeated the Israelites, and more than that, they've captured this ark, which again they believe is a god, or at least a house of a god of the Israelites. But they can't help themselves. They steal it, and they've got to show off a bit. And rather than, try to destroy it or put it somewhere else, or throw it off the cliff or something, they decide, hey, we're going to bring this into the house of our god, Dagon. And we're going to leave it there. We're going to show that our God has power over the Israelites' God, which is their mistake. The Lord obviously isn't going to allow this, and He does it. He shows them how He's not going to allow this in an interesting way. They leave it there overnight, and when they come out in the morning, the statue of Dagon there has fallen. But it doesn't just fall like to the side, like, oh, it's fallen down and we need to pick it back up. 1 Samuel 5 and verse 3, and when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. It had fallen face down before the Lord, before the ark. Like, you would think, if you're in a house of God, of your God, you would recognize, hey, there's probably some significance to this fact, that our God has fallen, a statue of our God has fallen face down in front of this God. Probably shouldn't keep him here anymore. But they decide, no, we're gonna do it again. They don't immediately get the picture. So they set the statue back up again and still leave it there. And as you would expect, the statue falls on its face again. But this time, not only does it fall, his head, the statue's head, and his hands are severed from the torso. So it's falling face forward again in front of the God, but the head's off and the hands are off. And they start to think, well, maybe there's something here. Maybe we don't need to have this in the house of our God. But to make matters worse, the people in Ashdod begin to experience a plague of sorts. It's a strange one. It says there's tumors. They begin to develop these tumors. Now, some of the commentators that I read said it was the bubonic plague, that was what they were getting. They're also overrun. We're not told here, but we're told later in chapter 6. They're overrun with mice. There's mice everywhere. So their God statue has been destroyed. It's been knocked down twice and destroyed. They're having tumors that are coming up all over them. There's mice that are overrunning. They've clearly got something that they don't need to have in their possession. So they kind of start this game of hot potato. They say, hey, we can't keep the ark here. We got to go. Let's just send it over here to Gath, another one of our cities. Well, you can imagine the Philistines, Gath, like, yeah, we'll take the ark. They haven't heard about what's going on yet. Yeah, we'll take it. Bring it here. We'll keep it in our place. Well, what happens? They get tumors as well. They get tumors and mice as well. That continues to follow the ark among the Israelites. So they said, well, we can't keep it here anymore. Let's get it somewhere else. Let's send it to Ekron. Well, obviously, by this time, the folks in Ekron have started to hear about some of the stuff that's going on with the Ark of the Covenant. So as soon as the ark arrives, they plead with the lords, the guys in charge of the Philistines, hey, send this back to Israel so it doesn't kill us. We've heard what it did in Ashdod. We've heard what it did in Gath. Don't let that same thing to us. Unfortunately, they don't do it fast enough. They're not quick enough to get it back. And there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city of Ekron, and that the men who did not die from that deathly panic were struck ill with tumors again. So again, what we are finding out here, what the Philistines are finding out here is God allowed them to capture the ark. They were allowed to do that. He didn't save the Israelites, even though the Ark of the Covenant was there. He didn't save them from being soundly defeated in battle. He didn't stop the Philistines from keeping the ark. But there's a limit to what he's going to do. There's a limit to where he's going to allow the ark to be, because it is the presence of God. It does represent that. And so he makes sure the Philistines know, hey, this is not something to be tampered with. This is not something that you are allowed to have. We're going to make it clear to you. So finally, towards the end of chapter 6, the ark is returned to the Israelites. They return it with 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, which is just strange. But again, they're trying to get rid of all this. They want it to go away. So it's returned to the Israelites, and then moving into chapter 7, Samuel, who is coming back into the story now, he calls for the Israelites to repent and to put aside their idolatry, and they do. 1 Samuel 7:4. So the people of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord only. So it took being soundly defeated. It took losing the Ark of the Covenant. And you've got to imagine for the Israelites, they knew what the ark was. It was the presence of God. They felt that God had left them. I mean, that was how they felt him here. You know, we can't really, sometimes I know you can feel that in your life you are so far away from God. You don't see him, you don't feel him, you don't feel like you can talk to him. You're away from him. And that's really personal to individuals. This was the entire people of Israel. They all felt like God was away from them because the ark is not there. That was what they could see. They could put their eyes on this and know. I mean, that's why they wanted it in the battle, so they could see that God was there with them. And for 8 months, it's not. It's in the hands of their enemies. You got to imagine how scary that must have been. How excited they must have been to get it back. Unfortunately, when they did get it back, some of the men made a mistake in not honoring the ark with the honor and the respect that it desired, and decided to look in the ark, which, newsflash, that's a bad idea. Don't look in the ark. If Indiana Jones has taught us anything, it's you don't look in the ark. No Indiana Jones. All right. And they're killed immediately. But not only do they get the ark back, we find out later the Philistines drew near to attack Israel, and the Lord causes them to be defeated at this point. So now we've got the ark back. We're putting away the Baals and the Ashtaroth. We're focusing on the right things. We're focusing on the Lord and not just a tool for battle. And in verse 13 of 7 says, so the Philistines were subdued and did not enter the territory of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. So again, we have this idea of Samuel, this wise and faithful leader who was bringing peace, bringing control of, keeping away from the Philistines and control of their area all by themselves, which is a great, great idea. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Yeah, a lot of parallels between there, and it is neat to see those. And obviously the folks at the time wouldn't have known that, but that's one of the benefits. And we talked about this earlier. One of the benefits that we have by having this Bible for us now is we can make those kind of observations that they couldn't have made at the time. Obviously, they couldn't see those at the time, but looking back, we can see, oh man, that's exactly what they were talking about. Or that's exactly why that happened that way, because it was telling us this is going to happen. It was harking back to what happened before. That's a great blessing that we have. That's one of, I think, what we're trying to focus on this set of lessons is being able to see these themes that run from Genesis all the way through, and they pop up in, and you're like, oh yeah, they talked about it in Genesis, and it's going to happen again later on here, and it's happening right now. So we certainly get a lot of those. All right, moving forward, let's go to 8. Chapter 8. We get a pretty big transition here, and this is kind of really the focus of this section of Scripture. It took us a while to get there, but this is the big transition. Up to this point, who had been the leaders for Israel recently? Who were leaders? What were they called? Judges. But there becomes a problem with that. First 3 verses here of 1 Samuel 8. But when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. Again, there was nothing that required any kind of hereditary passing of this judgeship from father to son. That was what Samuel decided, and it didn't go well for him. It's not just Eli who made some poor decisions regarding his sons. Samuel did as well. The name of the firstborn son was Joel, and the name of the second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. And we find here, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So what did the elders do? Then all the elders of Israel gathered together in verse 4 and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. Is there anything intrinsically wrong with the elders of Israel requesting, demanding a king? Just in general, is there anything wrong with that? Is there anything that's a problem about that? That's a tough one. It's not really an easy one to answer. Not necessarily, I don't think. It could be seen as a rejection of what God has put in place. God has put these judges in place, and you're saying, hey, give us a king. We don't want the judges anymore. I see that. Let's say it could have been done in a different manner and been done correctly. Remember, we know before Israel had even gone into Canaan, God had declared to his people that they would have a king, way back in Deuteronomy. They would have a king. The king would be selected by God and will be subject to God as the ultimate king. So we have God as the ultimate king, and then we have the earthly king here, who isn't really a king. He's more of he's not even a vice president. He's supposed to do the ultimate king's bidding, okay? He is in charge here, but he's in charge through God. God is instructing. God is ultimately in charge there. It's a theocratic monarchy. So it's a monarchy, it's a kingship, but it's theocratic. It's following God here. So what's the problem with this request? If it's not an inherent problem to request a king, what's the problem? Well, they're not contemplating a theocratic monarchy. They're not contemplating that God's going to be the judge. God's going to be the ultimate king, and they're going to have an earthly king who is just his kind of deputy. They want a king, and it says right here, to judge us like all nations. They want an autonomous king. They want a king who's there by himself, who's in charge. They want to be like every other nation, who has a king who doesn't answer to God or anybody else. That's the problem. Samuel, as you can imagine, doesn't take this very well. But when he prays the Lord about it, God says, hey, just so you know, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. How do I know they're rejecting me? Because they've done it since I brought them out of Egypt. Since the day I brought them out of Egypt, they've been continually rejecting me. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. But give them this warning. Tell them the dangers of what they are demanding. Tell them what's going to happen. That's just what Samuel does. He spends about 7 verses from 11 to 18 warning Israel that a king like they want, like those in the nations around them, would be oppressive, would be demanding, would be self-centered, would be the opposite of everything that they really want. And spoiler alert, the first king of Israel, Saul, is each of those things. He's oppressive, he's demanding, he's self-centered. So it doesn't take very long for Samuel's warnings to be to be shown, to be seen. But, as we know about the Israelites, they don't listen. And they didn't listen here to Samuel. And they sort of doubled down on their demand in verses 19 and 20. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." I mean, it's again this never-ending circle of drawing closer to being in trouble, falling apart from God, finding your way back, putting away the Baals and the Ashtaroths, coming back to God, defeating the Philistines, and all of a sudden, hey, we really need a king, not God, but a different king who can treat us like everybody else. We can be over here. God's over there. We're going to do it here. But that's what they want. Samuel tells God. God says, "You know what? Give them what they asked for." Lord says to Samuel in 22, "Obey their voice and make them a king." So finally, chapter 9, the last chapter. Saul chosen to be king. And we're finally introduced here to Saul. 1 through 3. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zerah, son of Becherah, son of Aphiah, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to Saul, his son, "Take one of the young men with you and arise, go and look for the donkeys." Saul then takes off on a 3-day search for his father's donkeys, which have been lost. He goes through Ephraim, he goes through Shalem, he passes throughout all the land of Benjamin. He cannot find them. And he is just about to give up when his servant that is with him says, "Hey, in this next city that we're almost at, there's a man of God, a prophet. And I know we don't know where to go, but let's ask him. Let's try to get to him and see if he can tell us where to go. Maybe he can give us some direction here." And that gets us to verse 10. Verse 10, "And Saul said to his servant, come, let us go." So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they went up the hill to the city, they met young women coming out to draw water and said to them, "Is the seer here?" Seer, prophet. Synonyms, not exactly the same thing, but it's prophet. They answered, "He is. Behold, he is just ahead of you. Hurry, he has come just now to the city because the people have a sacrifice today on the high place. As soon as you enter the city, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat till he comes, since he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Now go up, for you will meet him immediately." So they went up to the city. As they were entering the city, they saw Samuel coming out towards them on his way up to the high place. So they go in the city, and the women at the well direct them to Samuel. It's always women at the well. There is something about women at the well. They're involved in every story, and they can always send you kind of the right direction. They did here. He directs them to Samuel. But just in case you thought, well, this was just a chance meeting, they just happened to be there at the right place at the right time, that idea is quickly dispelled. Verse 15, "Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, 'Tomorrow about this time I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen my people because their cry has come to me.' When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, 'Here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall restrain my people.'" Now, we'll have to wait until next Wednesday to talk about Saul being anointed and what that means and what happens moving forward. But it is impossible to read this story, to read this first, 18, 19 verses of chapter 9 and not be cognizant, not recognize God is sovereign. God is in control, no matter the circumstances. There's 3 that's seemingly minor events, mundane, ordinary events that are crucial to Saul, the first king of Israel, eventually being anointed. First, Saul's father goes and tells him to find the donkeys. It just so happens that 3-day search leads him to the edge of the city where Samuel's coming to. Then they just so happens to run into these women coming from the well as he walks into the city. And they're able to tell him exactly where to find Samuel. They just happen to know exactly where he's going to be and all the things that he's going to do. And third, Samuel just so happens to be heading towards the high place as Saul enters the town and sees Saul. Again, 3 super minor events. Nothing significant about any of those, just ordinary events. But the 3 of them happen in a specific way, and none of those just so happened. They all happened because they are part of God's plan for Saul. Now, outside of understanding the significance of this particular historical event for the Israel nation, which it is, this is a big event for the Israel nation. We'll talk much more next week about how significant it was and what happens moving forward. I think it's important for us to understand that ordinary situations such as these can and are used by God for his good works. So we need to look for those things. We need to look for those opportunities in ordinary situations. I'll tell you a brief story, and then it'll be time for us to go. 4 months ago, my wife loves Garth Brooks. She would go to a Garth Brooks concert every night of the week if she could. She thinks he is amazing. In concert, I mean, she didn't listen to his songs, but in concert, she would love it. There was a Garth Brooks concert in Birmingham about 4 months ago. And she was going with a couple of her friends, some from up here, some from down in Tuscaloosa. And they're on a group chat, they're talking about, hey, when we're going to meet there, because they're kind of coming from different directions, we're going to eat at this place before we go, and here's where we're going to park, and all that kind of stuff. And one of the girls that was coming from Tuscaloosa, she didn't know really well, but knew who she was, sends a text message. And Kelly sends this text message to me, forwards it to me. And it basically says, hey, do you know of anybody in Decatur, any foster parents in Decatur who are looking to foster a girl? We've got a situation with a coworker, with a coworker's brother, where a girl was in the custody of her grandma, and her grandma's not doing well. She's about to pass. And they've got to find someone to take this girl, and the brother and his wife are not someone they can handle. And Kelly sends this text to me. We've adopted before. We had planned on adopting again, or fostering of some sort, but we weren't really there yet. We were still trying to get our legs underneath us. 3 kids is 3 kids is 3 kids. And stop, the Smiths. Okay, I got it. I know. So she sends it to me, and I said, okay, let's talk. Kind of works its way out. A week afterwards, that was sent on a Friday. The next Friday, I'm driving home with, and she just turned 6, a 6-year-old girl. We'll call her E, because I know we're streaming. E, with us. I'd never met E before. I didn't know E's family. I never heard of any of them before. Never knew them before. Don't know them now. Never had a situation. We were put in that for a specific reason. There was nothing about that situation that was extraordinary. It was a group text about a bunch of 30-something age girls who were talking about where they wanted to go eat. They wanted a Mexican restaurant to go eat at, and they were trying to figure that out. And this just happens to pop up. Hey, a coworker said this to me today. Kelly never talked to this girl. They don't have a chat in between them otherwise. She just happened to be in the group text. And Kelly just happened to be there too. And we just happened to be in a situation where we could take that girl. These ordinary situations happen all the time. You just got to look for it. Now, lest you think that I'm saying, hey, look at me, I've done everything great. I was terrified, still am terrified of this situation. But we're working our way through it. But it happens all the time. Another super brief example, Ben. If you haven't heard Ben's story, it's really, really, really neat. But Ben had the ordinary situation of being the best softball player at Beltline, and had a team back in the glory days of Beltline softball. Had a team that he caused to get together. He kind of ran, and as a result of the time that he spent with the men on that team, Ben is Ben. Ben is someone. There are some folks who, when they get up to talk or when they get up to pray, listen. John McGuire, when he gets up to pray, I feel like he's talking to God. When Ben gets up to pray, I feel like he's talking to God. Like I feel like he's got that connection. He's got that one way. It's going straight there. Something that I aspire to have. And Ben has that, and he's able to share that and bless all of us because of a softball team. These ordinary events. We know that God is in control. We know that his plan is going to happen. But we need to look out for God to show up in these seemingly mundane, ordinary situations. He doesn't need a big stage. He doesn't need a high-profile event to do his good work. If he can use a son who's being sent to look for some lost donkeys, and he can turn that into the first king of Israel, he can use anybody in any situation whatsoever, and certainly can use all of us as we go throughout our ordinary lives. Thanks, everybody. Wayne will be here. here next week, and hope you guys all have a great rest of the week. Thanks, guys.